generous introduction. I must apologize for getting your name wrong, and for still not really succeeding in, well, yeah, I admit, my language learning has been limited while I've been here thus far. So now I'm not writing God and Gaia, or I should definitely devote more time to that. So what I wanted to do in this presentation is briefly summarize the book. Of course, it's over 200 pages long, and I probably shouldn't attempt to do what I'm about to do, but that's fairly typical of me. I try to do things that I really shouldn't do. But I generally manage to pull them off. So we'll see if I succeed in summarizing the whole book in less than 50 minutes. So the core research question in the book, because there ought to be a research question, right, in a scholarly monograph, is this: is the Earth alive? Or merely a complex mechanism? So that's kind of, you can hold that thought in your mind. This is taken, by the way, during the lockdowns. I had to escape all the nonsense in the cities, even in Bali, and get away to the hills. No one was stopping me going to the coffee shop up the mountain, Gunung Batur in Bali. And I got up there early in the morning one day, and we just watched the sunrise. And all the mountains, the 7 hills of Bali, all were just gradually picked off as the sun rose. And yeah, I mean, absolutely incredible paradise. So, the first chapter of the book is about our notions of time. And it refers quite a bit to the work of a Scottish polymath called James Hutton, who invented a new theory of the system of the Earth. And he argued from empirical observations of rock strata in Scotland and north of England that the Earth evolved the conditions for the emergence of life over a huge span of time, like millions and millions of years in his thinking. And this led to what we call deep time cosmology, which gradually displaced humans and gods in the modern scientific history of life. Because this modern history no longer thinks in terms of succeeding generations as marking off the time span of the Earth. It sees the evolution of the Earth as over millions of years. So human generations become almost irrelevant in evolution. But the problem with this modern history is that it conceives of the Earth as an autonomous machine. And it has accompanied the rise of this cosmology, the Promethean, top-down re-engineering of life on Earth since the Industrial Revolution. And so industrial technologies are now so invasive globally that some say humanity has started a new epoch, which we call sometimes the Anthropocene. And some argue industrial humans, in order to live in this new epoch, need a new story. They talk about a new creation story based upon Hutton's idea of deep time. And that the argument is this new story will help industrial humans recover humility in their uses of the Earth. And that will help to recover from this more mechanistic cosmology of the industrial era. And it's argued this new cosmology will be more effective than, say, the cosmology of the Abrahamic religions. I argue in this first chapter that ancestral stories and traditions have actually more cultural and spiritual power in resisting the machine cosmology that has dominated the Earth for 200 years than this new creation story of the Americans and various other scholars around the world. So this is me on a kayaking trip, kind of a field trip with a bunch of scientists in the Hebrides, which is a great place to study religion and ecology because the rocks of the Hebrides are among the oldest visible rocks on the planet, reaching back hundreds of millions of years in their current form. And in these rocks you can see that they are geomorphic, so they're obviously volcanic, and you can see they've flowed, and then they've got stuck in time, and then they've got, over millions of years, the wind and the rain has smoothed them out. So if you go to, up to Merapi, you can see very recent lava. It's very sharp and jagged, whereas this is much smoother because it's been smoothed out by millions, hundreds of millions of years. So it's a really very, very old landscape to travel through. And particularly on a kayak, it's really beautiful. So Hutton theorized that this movement of rock from inside the planet into the outer layers of the planet was effectively made the Earth a living Earth. He observed, this is in Glen Tilt, so in this rock formation, you can see at the top of the photograph how the soil in which the trees are coming up has clearly been pushed up into a kind of V like that, and it's been pushed up by magma coming up from underneath. Now, again, you live in Indonesia, so you sort of know this. But if you live in Scotland, they didn't know this. They had no understanding of this in the 18th century, and probably the understanding here wasn't what we call scientific either. So Hutton was right at the beginning of working out how volcanoes and magma shape life on Earth, on the surface, so to speak, and shape the whole appearance of the Earth. But his theory, which he called the new theory of the Earth, did not fit with biblical time, which they measured then in the 18th century as being 6,000 years. So there was a lot of resistance, because even the scientists then thought the Earth was only 6,000 years old, believe it or not. So recently we discovered it's much older. So he was not popular, and he was seen as an atheist and all the rest of it, but it was Darwin who really made Hutton's theory mainstream, because Darwin wrote the book on evolution on the back of Hutton's work and the work of a geologist called Charles Lyell. But of course, if we don't know when time began, if we don't know how the world came to be as it is, if we can't even see the beginning of time, that's an interesting noise. It's not a volcano, I don't think. The question is, can we still hallow time? Can we still make our time sacred? And that's a real issue if you lose your original creation story. The second chapter is based on some of my observations over the years in Borneo. I've been coming and going from Borneo even longer than from Indonesia, as I lived in Malaysia initially in the 1980s. Thank you very much. So the second chapter is about the archipelago of Indonesia and Malaysia, but more especially the island of Borneo, which is, of course, the largest tropical forest island on the planet, as well as in this archipelago. And it was a key site of scientific discovery because Alfred Russel Wallace, along with Charles Darwin, discovered the theory of evolution. But he discovered it here in Indonesia. He didn't discover it in a greenhouse in England or in the Galapagos, but he discovered it here. And in fact, he wrote it down before Darwin wrote it down, even though Darwin became famous. So Indonesia really is the origin of the theory of evolution and not England. But anyway, that's another matter. Since the colonial era, Borneo's ancient and diverse forests have been largely destroyed for industrial timber extraction and replaced with oil palm. The indigenous people, the Dayaks, the Iban, the Penan, have been driven off the land largely, despite the critical evolutionary role that they played in sustaining the biodiversity of Borneo. And although, of course, their ecological role was neglected, both in Wallace's theory and by the state government of Kalimantan and Sarawak and Sabah. But the role in particular that I study in this chapter is the issue of biofuel, which you have here in Indonesia, right? And this misguided claim that biofuel is somehow good for the planet and better than oil. This is complete nonsense. It's totally unscientific. To turn virgin rainforest into a biofuel plantation and then refine that oil and then ship it and put it in motorbikes and claim that it's green. You go to Pertamina station and see green. No, it's worse than Saudi oil. It's worse than Indonesian oil. The carbon footprint is higher, as if CO2 was a poison, which of course it isn't anyway. Anyway, I'll come on to that in a bit. Now, here in Yogyakarta, speaking about the earth as alive is what in English we say it's like teaching your grandmother to suck eggs, because grandmothers used to know how to do things that their children have often forgotten. So it's a tradition, right, in Indonesia, but particularly in Jogja, that the earth is alive. And so when you go to the Kraton and you see these old photographs of the ceremonies that they perform on Merapi and at the sea, and then you see the line that is drawn from Merapi through the heart of the Kraton, past the Tugu, all the way down to the sea on some of their maps and drawings, you realize you are living in a sacred living landscape. So in a way, it's rather ironic that I should be writing a book trying to persuade people the earth is alive and using, having spent a lot of my time in Jogja, where you, of course, believe the earth is alive. However, it's often the case that Malaysian and Indonesian companies are still just like Western companies. They treat the earth as if it's dead. You can do whatever you like to it. Kill whatever on it, replace it with whatever you want to put on it. Like here, this is actually in Johor, but it's a photograph I took in 2019. Totally stripping. This is near Mount Ophir, which is a place where Wallace actually went. And I visited here. Yeah, it's just, but very similar things go on in Borneo, and this is a protest in Borneo about the rainforest being stopped down and asking for it to be stopped. And indigenous people made many similar attempts to stop the land being wrecked by the palm oil companies and the logging companies. Now, I've made various journeys into Borneo, and perhaps the most memorable for me of the journeys I made into Borneo was a journey where I encountered a troop of 70 pygmy elephants. So we went up I went to the Kinabatangan River Reserve in Sabah. I was the guest of the University of Sabah back in 2008. And there we were supposed to be going to look at an area where they'd been replanting native forest to encourage the orangutan to move back into the area. But actually the day we went there, they had a troop of pygmy elephants turning up, and so the orangutan were nowhere to be seen. But then they went and got the guide for the pygmy elephant, and we ended up playing a game with this 6-year-old pygmy elephant. So that they were across the river. In the central photograph, the group of them were across the river from us. There were about 8 of us, Indonesians, Malaysians and locals, and foreigners. And then one of them came across the river. And it was a 6-year-old female that you can see here. And she started to come towards us. And then she came towards us and she kind of wiggled her bum like this at us. And then the guide sort of hit her and then she ran off. And so basically, she wanted to play, in English we call it TIG. So in the playground, you know, you touch the child and the child runs off. And the elephant started to play a game with us. We didn't initiate the game. The elephant initiated the game. So for me, it was a very powerful moment because it was, I describe in the book as a revelation. Because we're so used to being the tops, the predator species, the one in control of everything. And here you had an animal bigger than us who was thinking ahead of us, inviting us into its landscape to engage with it on its terms, not our terms. So it was a very, very powerful moment for me. But anyway, so Borneo made a big part in my kind of environmentalist journey, you might say. But the other thing I want to say is about this book, Finding Eden, by Robin Hanbury-Tennyson. He's also an Englishman, Journey into the Heart of Borneo, where he found the Mulu Cave, which was, well, he was an Englishman who found it. It was found, of course, by Penang, and it was known by people who lived in that area, but few outsiders had ever seen it. And now, of course, it's part of a national park. But in the book, he notes the destruction that has gone on since he went there. But he also notes the incredible role of indigenous people in conserving biodiversity. And this is really very important. The third chapter, it talks about biodiversity in more detail and the way in which development, economic development, tends to wipe out diversity. If you look at the history of life over deep time, roughly 500 million years, if they get the dates right, in which there have been multicellular organisms, roughly 500 million years. The first started to appear. You can see fossils in Adelaide Natural History Museum of some of the earliest life forms, which are found in the Flinders Ranges here in Australasia. Now, in that time, there have been 5 huge explosions in the numbers of species on Earth. And then there's generally been some kind of cataclysm, often from an extraterrestrial object, or from a huge volcanic eruption, like Krakatoa, or indeed in Sumbawa, Tambora, and then you get a collapse of speciation. But what's amazing is in the history of the Earth, every time there's been a big, what we would call a catastrophe, looking back in geological time, the number of the species that come after are greater than before. So the Earth seems to be on a trajectory towards greater speciation, greater fertility, greater productivity, more beauty. And that's mirrored in human, linguistic, and religio-cultural diversity. In the Bible, you have the story of the Babel, that God purposefully created all the different languages, almost as a kind of punishment. And then as a punishment, now I need to try and learn another language in addition to the two I already speak in order to deal with that, which I fully acknowledge. But the point is that this religio-cultural diversity mirrors the ecological and the biological diversity. But the other thing that has more recently been argued is that biocultural diversity and religio-cultural diversity are mutually sustaining. So if you have development, economic development, which reduces cultural diversity, it may affect ecological diversity. If you have agricultural practices which reduce ecological diversity, it may affect cultural diversity. The place where this has been most widely studied is Papua New Guinea, because it's got the most diverse language in the world, of any contiguous place in the world. So it's known as biocultural theory. I started the book in the island of Sumbawa when I was visiting there, and this is a friend standing on the horseshoe shape left in the sand by a leatherback turtle after it's laid its eggs. So it comes up one side, digs the hole with its flippers, the eggs go in, 50 to 100 of them, and then it goes down the other side and back to the sea. And it's a wonderful thing to see and to be in places where you can experience this. But despite the fact that the Earth has a tendency to more biodiversity, modern humans have tended to reduce biodiversity. There have been a few hundred known extinctions of species since the colonial expansion of the late Middle Ages, from around 1500 onwards. But far more significant, soils, oceans, forests, farm fields are all being depleted around the world of wildlife by industrial farming and fishing and agrochemicals. And of course also by the spread of cement and concrete-based human habitat. Now the doctrine of development, the idea that people in countries like Indonesia need developing by people in countries like England, that idea was developed to justify colonialism in the 19th century. And there's an excellent book on this called The Doctrine of Development. And it basically was a way of justifying the so-called white man's burden, which was basically, we came to steal stuff from your land, but then when we did it, we said, no, we're really doing it for your good. I mean, that's the basic philosophy. You can find it in Immanuel Kant's Cosmopolitan History. You can find it in all kinds of Englishmen's writings in the 1920s, and of course in Dutchmen's writings as well. And nowadays, they try to continue the process, but they want to make it sound better. So now they call it sustainable development. In my humble opinion, there's nothing less colonial than about sustainable development than there is about development. It's just a UN scam to rename colonialism and post-colonialism as development. It's still about extraction. Extraction of your ingenuity, your labor, your wealth, your inheritance, your forests, your fields, your oceans, your mountains. Above all, of course, here in Indonesia, your gold mines and your lithium mines, because that's more valuable than your timber these days. That is still the name of the game, but we call it sustainable development. And even here in Indonesia, you find many people saying, oh, it's a really good thing, all these wonderful sustainable development goals. I give a very extensive critique of sustainable development in chapter 3 in this book, for those of you who are interested. And Dickie and I may disagree about that. I know Dickie teaches a whole course on development, and I'd be interested to have a conversation with him afterwards. But anyway, for now, if I'm going to get through this, I've got to keep going at quite a pace. Chapter 4 then, there are 8 chapters, is called Reverse Engineering Life. So essentially what I've just described which is a reduction in biodiversity of the planet, which is the tendency that's occurred since modernity, but arguably going back to colonialism, but much more rapidly since the Industrial Revolution. This has been really kind of put on speed by modern industrial agriculture and aquaculture and fishing practices. And this is partly because in the 20th century, scientists developed new techniques for plant and animal hybridization, which have increased the de-speciation impacts of agriculture and aquaculture. And in particular, the global spread of genetically modified organisms from the 1980s has increased these tendencies in industrial agriculture, while at the same time inflicting increasing harms on human health as GMOs are novel foods for which the human microbiome is not well adapted. So and then in tandem with increased scientific control and financialization of food systems, towards the end of this chapter, I described how nature conservation is also being drawn into this same kind of systematizing approach, where conservation is being increasingly financialized, technologies are being used, such as blockchain and satellite-linked biosensors. So essentially what's happening is human food, forests, savanna, grassland, and the oceans are all being drawn into a huge computerized system of sensors, the idea being that the UN and people in power, the big tech companies, the big food companies, can control everything and see everything. You know, oh, you bought a bag of rice, Pak Iqbal, on your way home, and they can actually trace that, and there'll be a sensor on the bag of rice. And when you get back to your house, they'll know how much rice you've got in your house. That's the world that is currently being constructed around us. And, but that world is a world of not only much increased control by few people and by technology, but a world of reduced beauty, reduced complexity, reduced biodiversity, and ultimately it's a dead world. We as humans cannot recreate the incredible complexity of the living planet that we have inherited, but we imagine that we can, and that we can even do better. And that's our big problem, I think, as moderns. I spent quite a bit of time in the 90s and early noughties studying genetic engineering. I was on a research group. We wrote this book, Engineering Genesis, The Ethics of Genetic Engineering. We had on that group a scientist called Ian Wilmot, who created Dolly the sheep. And Dolly, the sheep, is the sheep in the top. That is the first genetically engineered cloned animal on the planet. We met her in their enclosure one time, very special sheep. She's now preserved in formaldehyde in the Scottish National Museum, so you can still see her if you want to, if you ever come to Edinburgh. But this is science-informed agriculture. What scientists do is they take the DNA of a plant at the microscope level, and they literally shoot, using electricity, they shoot DNA into it to see if it'll catch. And then it's quite a random process, but they then grow hybrids from these cellular modifications, and they see what they come up with. And some of them are fast-growing, some of them are useless, and then they gradually get to the point where they come up with a crop that they want, such as genetically modified soy, which is resistant to Monsanto's highly toxic pesticide, glyphosate. And then they sell the seed, which is patented, and they sell the glyphosate, which is patented, and that's how they make their money. It's all about commercializing Mother Nature. But they'll tell you it's about feeding people and, you know, using less chemicals and all this kind of rubbish. But what actually happens when these hybrids are planted and then the chemicals are used on top is that the soils are depleted of minerals, of nematoids, of worms, and become lifeless. It just becomes like cement, just to hold the plant up. And everything else is added from outside with fertilizers and chemicals. So this is industrial engineering, but it also impacts human health. So eating food from that kind of environment impacts the human microbiome. So food grown on less bacterially rich soil with chemicals that kill bacteria makes it into your stomach, and your stomach then loses bacteria too. You end up with less diversity. Scientists call the microbiome the rainforest inside. The rainforest inside. And so they've now worked out that the healthiest people, the longest living people on this planet, have the richest diversity of bacteria in their stomachs. Don't ask me how they do that, it's a bit unpleasant, but I'll explain later if you want. But the point is, this is all done in hospitals, but it's all, and universities. Now, the other thing about environmentalism, and what I observed in writing this book, was the way that increasingly environmentalism is being caught up in this control agenda and development agenda. And if you look back at the origins of the environmental movement, you come across a book like Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, where he's basically saying in that book, the problem with the planet is human beings. The planet's got a virus. I mean, even James Lovelock used that analogy once. We need to deal with this virus, maybe by killing the virus, or maybe by getting rid of a lot of the people. And so what you're persuaded by a lot of environmentalists is, the problem with the planet is human beings. It's not industrial development, it's not big tech, or big ag, or big fishing, or whatever. No, it's you, and it's your children and your children's children. You are the problem, right? It's an anti-human philosophy. We call it misanthropic in English. It's a French word. English is a bastard language, French, German, Latin mainly. Anyway, the population bomb is a myth. It wasn't true. In fact, a number of countries now have a demographic problem. Italy is no longer replacing itself. And this causes economic problems in countries which don't replace themselves. The world's population will almost definitely peak below 10 billion. But the real point I'm trying to make is that environmentalism is being used as an excuse to control people, even the number of children they have. But the problem with the planet does not originate in ancestral people having children and following their practices. But along with this population idea is the idea that we have to get people off the planet. So the idea of half Earth, that half the Earth should be no one living in it, no one looking after it, just left to go wild. And that we're told that will be the answer to our environmental problems. In this book, I deeply disagree with that. And Arun Agrawal calls this environmentality, using Foucault's ideas, so that environmentalism and conservation are turned into a means for control and top-down government and statist control. And increasingly you see that in the use of technology in conservation and the use of government controls like state parks to exclude people, not actually to heal the earth. Well, I'm not going to talk a long time about COVID-19. We all got very bored with it, and I don't want to talk about it too long. But I do include a chapter on it, because what I saw in COVID-19 was a repeat of what's going on in conservation. That COVID-19 was used to increase control over human beings, mainly using these things. QR codes, track and trace. Have you got a vax? Where's your QR code? You can't come in this cafe. You can't get on this plane. All of that. Or even they can trace you when you got off the plane, or when you got off the train, or where did they go? And because they can follow you on your phone, you have to sign up for some track and trace system. Why do they want to track and trace human beings like that? What is that really about? Well, the agenda, the broader agenda, we call it biosecurity. Again, drawing on Foucault's ideas about biopolitics. I mean, whatever one's feelings about Foucault, and my feelings about Michel Foucault are very mixed. However, because I think he's far too Marxist for me these days. But I think that he was a prophet about biopolitics. Biopolitics is taking over. It's taking over nature conservation, it's taking over farming and food. And there is a risk now it's going to take over us too. Biosecurity is the new frame for politics now. In this chapter I argue that this is the wrong frame, and that it's not going to make things better, it's going to make things worse. Locking people up, preventing them getting outside, all the things that happened during COVID, people can't go swimming in the sea, they can't go to the national park, and even spraying chlorine everywhere, and to me this kind of says it in one, they wrecked the earth, they covered it with chlorine and they poisoned all the plants and everything else because they were afraid there was a little virus in there. But on the plus side, we sure beat that coronavirus. Well, that was my feelings about COVID. There we are. This, of course, comes from John Stuart Mill and the idea of the panopticon, the all-seeing eye. He designed a prison where one person in a watchtower could see inside every cell. These prisons were hardly ever built. The American prisons are not that dissimilar. They have open gates on all the American prisons. And that comes from Mill's idea, actually. And it means you have no privacy as a prisoner in an American jail, unless you're put in a 24/7 lockdown, windowless cell, which is a form of torture, but they do that widely in American jails. But the broader point is this turn of human society towards constantly being surveyed by satellites and smartphones and track and trace and so-called smart cities and smart devices and everything. We saw in COVID a merger between that smart agenda and biology and even what's in our bloodstream. And it's not at all clear to me, if we look at the statistics, that that merger had good health outcomes. From my point of view, better health outcomes will come from increasing the connections between humans and nature, increasing diversity, increasing the numbers of people involved in growing food, not locking them up in cities and growing food in factories and shipping them in and preventing them going out into the nature somehow to save nature. This is just totally the wrong agenda. Well, coming on then to the heart of the kind of answers, if you like. If that was all the pathology, there's a lot of pathology in this book. So pathology means a study of disease. Maybe there are too much disease and not enough healing in the book, but I was living through a pandemic when I wrote the book, so maybe that's partly why that happened. Anyway, now we come on to the Earth as Gaia. So James Lovelock, and I think I've got a photograph of him here, he is an English inventor and maverick. And it's really funny that Dickie should start this talking about James Bond, because, you know, I mean, I don't really watch James Bond films anymore. Well, I might, but only on YouTube, and they've been out for 5 years, so I don't want to pay to see them. I don't think they're very good cinema. But I discovered that James Lovelock, according to his biographer, used to work for MI5. And not only did he work for MI5, his biographer compared him to Q, who is the eponymous head of research of the British Secret Service in the James Bond films, who's always coming up to Bond and saying, try this new phone. And Bond picks it up and it starts doing things, you know, and he points at it and it sets the curtains on fire. Well, this is actually not a bad image of James Lovelock. He was a complete outsider in one sense. He worked in his own workshop, but then, of course, it turns out he did work for MI5. Because his brain was so inventive that they wanted his work. And so did NASA, and so did Shell, the company my father also worked for. So he worked for 3 of the biggest organizations on Earth, MI5, NASA, and Shell. And the first invention that he made, which really changed the world, was a small device for measuring tiny, tiny amounts of chemicals in the air. And this device was seminal in the birth of environmentalism, because he made it in the 60s, and it allowed people to go outside and see that the air was polluted, and it very rapidly changed the environmental regulations. He also worked with NASA, and they asked him to see whether he could find life on Mars. And he thought about it for a while and scratched his head. He finally came up with a novel solution. He said, all we need to do is study the atmosphere on Mars. But if we can study the atmosphere, we can work out whether there's life or not. No one had ever thought of that before. And that led to the Gaia theory, according to which Earth generated the conditions for life over time in the atmosphere, and life adapted the Earth's atmosphere and temperatures to achieve what is called in Greek homeostasis. Now, we all have homeostasis inside of us, and we all got to know it rather well during COVID, didn't we? Because you go into a building and you say, oh yeah, I'm 37.5, can I have my coffee now, please? They were measuring our temperature all the time. Well, what keeps our body temperature in the proper range is called homeostasis. Our body's got all kinds of ways of regulating temperature, like the hairs on our skin, sweating, the skin surface, of course, being exposed to wind. All of it is many other devices. Very, very complex temperature regulation mechanism. The Earth, Lovelock said, has a similar temperature regulation mechanism. And what regulates the Earth is life. So he argues that life, as it evolved, the plants and the animals, but even the rocks of the Earth and the oceans all work together to create an atmosphere which was roughly stable and which therefore could sustain more life and more fertility and more speciation and all these other things. Essentially then, the Gaia theory is a view of the Earth as a system of systems. We think of the body as a system of systems, you know, the nervous system, the circulatory system. So the Gaia theory is very analogous to that. And But I argue in this book that the Gaia theory also revived traditional religious ideas that the Earth is alive. And of course, the Gaia theory is opposed to mechanistic science. And glyphosate is a very powerful example of mechanistic science. It's used widely in Indonesia. It's used on all GM crops. It's used on all hybrid rice. But it's highly toxic to life. And this quote here, I'm not going to read it, but the quote is about people seeing things happening to children in the environment, all beginning to happen on a wide scale from the 1960s onwards, when they started using glyphosate so extensively. Glyphosate was invented as part of the Green Revolution. It works by switching off the electrical signaling system in plants. Now, that's an electrical system. It's a hormonal system, it's a chemical system, it's a nervous system. We think all these things are separate. But no, I'm influenced by the radiation that is in my machines. If you hold a remote control of your car to your head and stand 200 yards away, I learned this from Jeremy Clarkson, by the way, it'll work more effectively. It works from further away. It's just a small example. All of these electrical devices are interacting with this electrical system. But what the scientists said, oh no, but this chemical won't affect the human system. It's just going to affect plants. But now there's cases all over the world, legal cases. People have been poisoned by glyphosate, and the European Union is now talking about banning it, but there's a huge lobby to prevent it being banned. Lovelock's theory then is exactly that all of these systems do interact. We are alive, the Earth is alive. They all interact. We should not create things as if they don't interact. And so James Lovelock put it like this: perhaps the single most important thing we can do to undo the harm we've done is to fix firmly in our minds the thought that the Earth is alive. And if we did that, we'd do less damage. So I'm going to skip a couple of these quotes, so a bit too much here for the time available. But the key point about Lovelock's theory was that he felt that Gaia was in some ways self-directed, goal-directed, towards making more life and making it more fertile. But he came under huge attack from mechanistic scientists. And so he recreated the Gaia hypothesis as like a computer system approach. He called it, it's called cybernetics. Gregory Bateson, the father of that, connection again with Bali here in Indonesia, interestingly. I think that this was a mistake. And I think that the cybernetic understanding of the Gaia theory of the Earth as a system of systems, as if it's like software, code in a hardware system, actually still is mechanistic. And I think we need a more spiritual vision of Gaia and the Earth. And that's what I do in the next chapter. But I also agree with Michael Ruse, who wrote a whole book on Gaia theory also. He says we should not pretend that the Gaia project is lacking in a goal. If you believe in Gaia, you believe it's directed to certain ends. And modern science doesn't like this. Modern science wants to be able to say it's all just machines. There's no inherent goals. There's no inherent purpose in this. It's kind of random. But the Gaia theory really, I think, I agree with Ruse here, doesn't accept that and rejects that. So in the penultimate chapter, I finally get around to religious studies and interreligious studies. And I look at the analogies between the Gaia theory and theology. But I begin the chapter by looking at scientism, which is the modern religion, right? Which is increasingly dominating industrial societies. It was scientism that told people not to go to church, not to go to the mosque, stay in their houses, even though breathing indoor air is actually more polluting than outdoor air. But the religion of science was what people were living under for 1-2 years during the COVID regime. And they were told to stop practicing their traditional religion and submit to the new religion, the religion of science, which of course is the dream of the positivists. Auguste Comte in the 19th century, I'm sure he's very happy. But it is ultimately an atheist cosmology. It's an atheist religion. And atheism tends to become tyrannical. And that's what I would argue we saw in the COVID times. We were being told what we had to put in our bloodstreams, who we could meet, where we could go. This is tyranny, absolute tyranny, in the name of health. And to me, it's a total contradiction of all that I believe and all that I've learned from reading Revelation and trying to study the earth. Against this, I would argue the Gaia theory is a scientific retrieval of the belief common to most cultures and to pre-modern religious traditions that the earth is alive and that the forces which animate the earth, other creatures than humans, emanate from a supreme mundane divine source, whether we call that source Allah, the universe, Brahma, or whether we call it the Tao. That is a belief that's common across many religious traditions. And what I argue in this book is for a spiritual vision of the Gaia theory, and that vision has the potential to revive respect for freedom and autonomy in human beings and in the other beings, so that we respect ourselves better and we respect other beings better. If we finally recover what we were losing in modernity, which is a belief in a sacred cosmos and in the energies which animate that cosmos. Well, again, I'm going to have to skip a bit. This is, of course, from Lynn White's book, The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And he talks about the Faustian knowledge and the way that it is capable of wreaking havoc across the globe in that famous essay. Horkheimer and Adorno made the same complaint in their very famous essay, Dialectic of Enlightenment, about the troubling increase in human power over nature, and how this, having originated as Enlightenment, risks a new kind of dark ages tyranny, which is what they really argue against in that very important essay. C.S. Lewis, the author of the Narnia stories, he also forecasts that science would end in technocratic tyranny. And the very famous quote, I'm not going to read it, but from The Abolition of Man, where he argues exactly that. But if you look at the Christian tradition and other traditions, you see a very different vision of a living earth. This is almost like a mandala in an apse of a church of San Clement in the city of Rome, which I always go there whenever I visit Rome. It's absolutely a beautiful image. And what it shows is kind of palm leaves, the cross, but Christ is not dead, he's alive. There are doves, and then, of course, there's the dove interceding, and then ultimately the Father in heaven. And all the other creatures, angels, extraterrestrials, if you like, aliens, who knows, but they're all there, all the other creatures, and inside the mandala, the different creatures on the earth, and they're all caught up in the work of redemption and salvation. This is a vision of a living earth being redeemed and sustained by a living God. And we find the same kinds of thinking in Taoism, in the Tao Te Ching. People like Thomas Merton and Alan Watts spoke up for this tradition, and in the 60s and 70s kind of recovered Taoism for Westerners and argued that it was more holistic and ecologically respectful religion than Western Christianity as it had become. This is a very interesting quote from Alan Watts, which I will read. The important difference between the Tao and the usual idea of God is that whereas God produces the world by making, the Tao produces it by not making, which is approximately, in English, what we mean by growing. For things made are separate parts put together like machines, or fashioned from within inwards like sculptures, whereas things grown divide themselves into parts from within outwards. So, from my perspective, Taoism as a tradition speaks very powerfully to the sorts of insights that you find in the Gaia theory. But I also found very important analogies between the Gaia theory and the Hindu tradition. And here you have the Bhagavad Gita, and I will quote this. It's an English translation, obviously, but a very good one recently by John Smith. You should always perform with detachments the tasks that have to be done, for by performing actions with detachment, a man attains the highest good. It's through action that Janaka and others achieve perfection. You should act too with the very maintenance of the world in view. That's a fascinating sentence. You should act too with the very maintenance of the world in view. What the good man folk does, other folk do also. He sets a standard and the world follows it. But in the heart of the Bhagavad Gita, then, is the claim that ritual sustains the world. Ritual sustains ecosystems. Ritual sustains nature. It's not just cultural. It's eco-cultural, biocultural. Religion serves the planet. It isn't just a planet is a place for us to practice our rituals. It's a mutual process. And there is in the Bhagavad Gita, 6,000-year-old text. The same sorts of ideas, I think, are present in Christianity at different times. And Raymond Panikar gave some lectures in Edinburgh University many years ago, the Gifford Lectures, which ultimately he published as The Rhythm of Being. And he argued there for a kind of holistic understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity. And he observed how in the Vedic texts you have this idea of the human as a microcosm that maps onto the macrocosm of the earth, but even of the whole solar system. And he argues that that dynamic conception of participation between the human and the whole cosmos is fundamental to the Christian as well as to other traditions. And that means it's important that when we do things, when we make things, when we use technologies, we do them in ways that are beautiful. I mean, I've just put there a photograph of a guitar that I happen to enjoy playing, but it is a beautiful instrument and it makes a very beautiful sound. But in this perspective then, religion is about maintaining the world. And it's about fitting ourselves and our actions to the world, to created order, and learning from created order how to live. And that's kind of the core message of the chapter. Where in modern Christianity one finds this message is harder to discern. But for me, the best modern theologian who comes closest to an analogy between what I'm talking about in the Gaia theory and modern theology is a man called Friedrich Schleiermacher, a German theologian. And he actually did argue that we need to think less in terms of God outside, creating a machine that set in motion and then God leaves it alone. He spoke instead about a continuous process of activity, which he said is analogous to religious experience. And I think that comes very close to what I'm arguing for in this book. Well, finally then, Gaian ethics. It's 2 o'clock, about half a minute left, or if that. But in this chapter, I describe a number of case studies where what I've talked about in the book is enacted in reality. And the first case study makes sense, and the only one I've got time to discuss now is taken from the island of Bali. And I'm going to whiz through these slides fairly quickly. Bali is known by many people as rather a magical place. One explanation is on this sort of ley lines I said to run around the planet, or Earth's chakras. Well, make of that what you will. But it's been heavily studied by Western anthropologists like Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead. Of course, Bateson came up with his whole theory of cybernetics, but he also came up with a theory that cultures involve conscious purpose. They develop some kind of teleological structure connected to the natural environment and the evolution of human beings and their reproduction. So to me, studying all of this in Bali was very relevant because it's got a history of anthropologists theorizing about these things. But more particularly, Bali was a place in the 70s where they experimented with the green revolution. So Jakarta organized for some Swiss engineers to move into Bali and set up what they called the Bali Irrigation Project. This went on for more than 15, 20 years. And the scientists came to Bali and said, you've got all these temples and priests telling you what to do. We can do it much better than them. So we're going to give you some new rice and some new chemicals, and you can plant. We want you to plant more often, like 3 times a year, not just twice a year. You don't need to worry about your neighbors doing. Just get on with it. Ignore the priest. And you'll all grow lots more rice, and it'll be wonderful. Scientific, future, paradise, and all that. Well, not long after the project began, Bali began to suffer from pest plagues, from droughts, and instead of the rice production going up, it actually went down. And the engineers responded by new seeds, more chemicals, they built some more irrigation channels, on and on and on it went. None of these things fixed the problems. The point was the engineers who introduced the techniques knew nothing of the 1,000-year-old evolved system of rice growing in Bali. They just thought it was superstition, that they timed their planting and flooding the fields collectively according to what the priests in the water temples told them to do. They thought it was superstition, magic. It had nothing to do with efficient agriculture. They called it the rice cult of Bali, and they told them all to ignore it. The result of ignoring it was disaster. So the Balinese farmers gradually started a campaign. They said, look, we were doing much better when we followed the priests than we're now following you engineers. Why don't you let us go back to what we used to do? But this was dismissed as religious conservatism by the agricultural and development experts. But they commissioned academics at Udayana University in Denpasar to investigate the problem. And they found that the result of the policy of continuous uncoordinated rice planting had actually been all of these plagues and everything, and that what they needed to do was to investigate more carefully the connections between the hierarchy of the Subak water temples and the cropping patterns. The scientists had come in, totally disrupted an evolved pattern, which was a system of systems, assuming it was meaningless. And as a result, they actually reduced rice production. Now, the anthropologist Stephen Lansing from the States was doing field work in Bali at the time. He wrote a report for the Asian Development Bank, and he concluded that the rituals of the water temples were not a template for an outmoded civilization, but a system of ecological management with deep historic roots in Balinese culture. Agriculture was a social as well as a technical process, dependent on the hydraulic solidarity achieved by the temple system. Continuous rice cropping threatened both the ecology of the terraces and the social infrastructure of production. And I love the title of the book that he finally wrote, Priests and Programmers, because the priests beat the computer programmers. And I say yay to that. I do not want to live in a world run by AI algorithms, Google, Apple, and all the rest of them. A quote again from Lansing. The substitution of the high-tech and bureaucratic solution in the event proved counterproductive and was the major factor behind the yield and cropped areas declines experienced between 82 and 85. The cost of the lack of appreciation of the merits of the traditional regime has been high. Project experience highlights the fact that the irrigated rice terraces of Bali form a complex, artificial ecosystem which has been recognized locally over centuries and centuries, I would add. The idea, though, of religion playing an important role in agriculture was inconceivable to development planners. Well, for me, the Bali narrative, I was writing the book in Bali, and then I came across, almost by happenstance, this case study, and it just was perfect. So it absolutely confirmed what I was finding in my study of Gaia and theology, which is that if you treat the world as dead, if you treat human culture as having no evolved purpose, you end up wrecking it. Whereas if you see human culture as living, if you see the earth as living, and therefore as deserving of respect, you're more likely to live it successfully and hopefully, and in ways that do not destroy it. Well, again, I'm skipping a bit slides because I'm at the end of my talk, but I just end with this thought, which is connected with the very latest physics. Interactions between particles across time and space in particle physics were dubbed spooky by Albert Einstein, but Bell's theorem demonstrated that they're real not only in the minds of the observers. Such mysterious interactions are now known as quantum entanglement, and it's reasonable to suppose that involved interactions between Balinese temples, the moon, calendars, ceremonies, rice growing, soil structure. All of these practices involved information, which was constantly exchanged over 1,000 more years, and that's obviously Batesman's theory, which Lovelock used to try to explain how Gaia actually works. These interactions might, though, I would argue, also involve spooky, magical, invisible quantum entanglements in which farmers, rice plants, watercourses, and the larger energy fields, including the magnetic, which constitute this whole Earth and the island of Bali, are involved in the very productive Subak system of Bali. I'm going to leave it there, but thank you very much for listening, and look forward to taking some questions in the next 30 minutes. Thank you.
All I can say is 3 words. Yeah? Wow, wow, wow. Well, speaking of sustainable development, I just submitted one article on sustainable development just yesterday, and I was so very happy to do that. Then after listening to your statement, I said, no, I shouldn't have done that. I was thinking about, what other lingo to use, it was hard. Usually I don't use the term sustainable development because I'm no longer working for the UN, and I find that the term is simply just too technocratic and too bureaucratic, and I usually use the term sustainability. But nowadays, I think there's that tendency to go back to the idea of regeneration instead of the usual sort of language of sustainable development. The other one is this idea about the Cartesian effect, that man is a machine, that the earth is a machine, and that we're all living in this sort of system of machinery. And I think this would probably point out one of the foremost contribution of this, because we tend to forget that the earth is what generates life, essentially, right? And I was just wondering, you sort of put us on this journey in your book, from chapter 1 until the end. And I can see that there is this sort of transitions from cosmology, theology, but then you didn't really talk much about eschatology. So I was wondering whether there is any sort of implications of this idea about Gaia, God and Gaia, in the eschatology of either in the Christian faith or in any faith, right? Because that is, after all, part and parcel of our sort of faith, so to speak, right? The other thing is, what has this project done to you? I mean, in terms of your own sort of religiosity, I can see that there is a sort of revisionist stance on the way, I guess, Christianity looks at the earth. And, you spoke about the sort of conventional belief that the earth is only, 6,000, 7,000 years old, but yet, we are now dealing with this idea that the earth might be millions, hundreds of million years old. I mean, as you know, I have an eco-village in Langran, and the ancient volcano there is said to be 60 million years old. And you sort of like to think, if Adam came to Earth 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, I mean, that's a long time span where there was no human being, so to speak, right? So, what happened? I mean, how do we contend with this fact, so to speak, or this belief? And so I'd love for you to sort of comment on some of these things, but I do wish that the audience would also respond and perhaps ask some questions or provide any comments. Let's make this Wednesday forum a bit longer this time, since this is a very special occasion. And let's sort of think about maybe 2:45 to end this, yeah? And to do that, for those of you who can pose any smart questions, we will be giving out these counterfeit copies of the book later on, only for the best 3 questions, yeah? They're not original. Mind you, nothing is original here. But yeah, we are very happy to give out Michael's book, yeah? So any questions, comments, please? You can step forward to the, yes, Sister Ines, and then the Mas, would you like to stand next behind Sister Ines so that we can save time? Who else? One more, at least? You can ask anything and everything. Michael here is almost like a prophet now, you know, with his book. Yeah. Michael, would you like to sit on stage? There? Yeah. Go ahead, Sister Ines.
Okay, thank you. I hope I will get the book.
We'll see.
Wait. Pak Norcott, I like the words that you put in the title, On a Living Planet. It informs your reader that planet, the Earth, is alive. And alive means growing, evolving toward maturity. There is a scientist, a Jesuit scientist, Gaia, and he also learned about the rock. And after learning the rock, he invents a concept, the evolutionary universe. The universe, including the Earth, moves toward its perfection, its beauty, its fullest. And in your sentence, the Earth moves toward the increasing species diversity. In terms of spirituality, Gaia calls it the evolutionary creation. I wonder if you also mention about this man in your book, or mention about the evolutionary creation in your book. And the second thing is about the Earth and development. The Earth, human, and development. You mentioned that the Earth desires to go forward to the perfection or to the diversity. In Tayar's sentence, phrase, this is to its full beauty. But the development, human development done by human, tends to deplete or reduce the beauty, as any development needs a cost. How should we, my question is, how should we, human beings, presumably indifferent from evil personal interest, negotiate these two interests, which it seems in conflict? I remember that you quote your words in page 2003, and would you elaborate this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Ines. Next, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Reza, if you remember. I have a question that is based on a suspicion. So my question first, why does the Gaia concept stops at the Earth? We know that the energy that comes for our life, it comes from the sun, and then the seasons, our atmospheric conditions, they come from the energy that comes from the sun. And then we also know that the moon also modulates our life in many ways, not only in humans also. So why does it stop at Earth? What stops it from going interplanetary, as you say about Mars earlier? This comes from my suspicion. I am happy that Mbak Ines talk about Teilhard de Chardin, because this is also my response to Teilhard de Chardin's idea about the omega point, that is also similar to the Gaia theory, that is more teleological. I think I have a suspicion that maybe they stop, both James Lovelock and Teilhard de Chardin stops at Earth because there is an anthropocentric idea that is embedded in their ideas. Why? Because it revolves around the definition of life. So only with a certain definition of life that you can understand Gaia, that you can understand the omega point in Teilhard de Chardin's idea. For example, until today, the scientists struggle to define if the virus are parts of life, or is it not life? Because it is very unfamiliar to how we define life, because it's not like us. So maybe you can help me to understand, you can help me to resolve this suspicion of mine that life is anthropocentric. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One last question, please. Okay, monggo Mbak. So we probably know who's going to get the books. No? Yeah, go ahead. Please make your question succinct.
Yeah. My question is simple. So I remember when I was a child, I fear about the Judgment Day, and in my bachelor degree, I studied chemistry, and I learned this entropy, so the disorder, what is that? The gradual decline into disorder of universe. So my question is, what is this Gaia theory talk about the entropy, the gradual decline into disorder? Thank you.
Okay, Michael? You've been asked to sit.
Can you summarize it? I didn't hear incredibly clearly. It must be the PA, but also I'm a bit deaf. Can we get a summary of Sister, in a couple of words, what was the core of the question, Sister Inez? You want me to answer? Can we get a summary of it? Can you summarize it? More or less. Okay, go on then. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. If I can remember, that is, I didn't bring my pen with me. But, yeah, Sister Ines was asking something, which was very important. I'll go to Sister Ines' question last, but the second one asked about, my memory is also failing me, I'm getting old these days.
It was kind of about how we define life. Is that right?
Yes, that was the last one. And the interplanetary sort of existence, why did you just focus on the forces of the Earth,
Yes,
life on Earth, instead of the other planets and the sun?
That's what I thought I was hearing. So the second question is really great because I'm working on a new book, and it's called The Truth About Climate. Religion and Ethics on a Warmer, Greener Planet. That's my next book. I've been working on it now for 2 months. I think that title's going to stay. I like the title because it still leaves open what I'm going to say. Though what I'm going to say is going to be quite controversial as far as the United Nations is concerned. But who cares? I don't care about the United Nations anymore. If they can't stop people fighting, what's the point of it? Why don't we just close it down now? It's a control mechanism, that's all it is. But the point is, you're absolutely right, that the forces of life on Earth are deeply interconnected with the living solar system. And this has been massively underestimated by the people who call themselves climate scientists in the UN circles in the last 30 years. And I, for my sins, as we say in the Christian tradition, maxima mea culpa, believed what some world scientists had told me, that the CO2 coming out of my Honda ADV motorbike would be having an influence on the temperature of the planet. I have now studied this matter more thoroughly than I admit that I did before, and I no longer believe this to be the case. And I will explain why in the book. But at the heart of it is a point that was made in the second question, that the forces of life on Earth are deeply interconnected with the living sun, with the other planets, with the comets, with cosmic rays from the sun, with variations in solar insolation, which means radiation, the radiation that reaches the Earth. And these have all played huge roles. One of the ways in which the Earth interacts with the universe is magnetism, right? The Earth is magnetic. And the Earth's core has a lot of metal in it. And that's what gives us the metallic poles, north and south, which are not the geographic poles. But I don't know whether you know, but both of those poles are moving at the moment. We call it polar migration. One is moving from Canada to Siberia, so Putin seems to be winning that particular war. And the other one is moving from Antarctica into the Southern Ocean. Now, Einstein theorizes that the last time this happened, the crust of the Earth spun on the core. The liquid separates the crust from the core, and that it moved around. And there's a lot of other theories about this put about by people who are called pseudoscientists like Graham Hancock, which will come to a question that Dickie answered about how we've only been here 6,000 years. But my point is, it's a great question because it's exactly what I want to work on next. And the other point I would make is this. Most religious traditions knew this. It's in the pyramids. It's in Machu Picchu. It's in Borobudur. They were situated in relation to the moving pattern of the stars in the sky, a moving pattern, by the way, which occurs over tens of thousands of years. And the ancients knew the pattern. We call it precession. It's to do with variations in tilt of the Earth. We now call them Milankovitch tilts. But this has also given me huge respect. Dickie asked me what influence the book had had on me. I used to find it quite frustrating that UGM could never tell me in advance the dates of the semesters in the next year. Because, of course, they don't know when Ramadan's going to be, do they? Because they have to wait for the moon to come up. But now I have more respect for that than I had before. Because what it's saying is, no, we don't just have machines here. We still think that our culture, even the schedule of this university, should be coordinated with the living universe. And I now actually admire that, whereas I used to find it very frustrating.
Well, even until now, Mike Quinlan is still, frustrated. When are we going to Ambon? When are we going to Makassar?
Not until the moon rises.
Days, I said, inshallah,
But I get it now, that's the point. I get it now, I didn't before.
And then the question on eschatology. I mean, what is your take on that? And eschatology. I mean, what happens,
Before or after?
when we die or when the human species become extinct, for instance?
Yeah. Well, of course, we have a new eschatology now, and it's called climate science. And we're all being told that we're all, Greta Thunberg, the little girl, goes around saying we're all going to be wiped off the face of the earth because we keep driving cars, even though she does seem to use rather a lot of planes and trains and luxury yachts to get around the world herself. I don't believe this. If I ever did, I certainly don't believe it now. But this is a false eschatology. But false eschatologies can be very dangerous. If people keep telling you the world's going to end tomorrow, you must change this and change that, it can make people do very extreme things. Like the British government recently changed the energy bill. It's now a crime in Britain to misreport the energy performance of your toaster. The device for toasting bread. You know what I mean? I mean, this is insane. Britain is locking down its economy for an extinction event that is not going to happen anytime soon. So, yeah, this is false eschatology. We call it climate catastrophism, or environmental alarmism, or climate porn is one phrase coined, climate pornography. And it's very, very demotivating and highly problematic, but it's based on rubbish science, in my humble opinion, as a humanities professor. So, as for religious eschatology, I think they're also quite problematic. I mean, during COVID, we were all told that this QR code society was the sign of the beast, the mark of the beast had finally come true, and now we had the war in Israel. There are probably already evangelicals online in the US on YouTube saying, well, I told you, it's all happening now, we're going to get Megiddo next week, I was a teenager once, and I had these kinds of religious enthusiasms, and I read The Late Great Planet Earth, and I thought I was a Zionist, but I'm not anymore. And the Bible's eschatology, to me, is primarily about the fall of the Roman Empire, which did come true, actually. I mean, it did eventually fall. And that's what the book of Revelation really describes. When Jesus talks about people who are on the coast needing to get to the mountains, he seems to be talking about a coming great flood. Well, I think that could happen. Whether Jesus knew that or not, I don't know. But I mean, there had been a previous flood, and I think that did happen 12,000 years ago. I am increasingly of the view that humans beings have been here far longer than modern science claims. There have been many civilizations previous to the last 12,000 years, and that we have monuments to these which are being buried and misunderstood by scientists. And we may be at the end of our current era, but humanity has always survived and thrived. If we are, so be it. There's nothing we can do about it. It won't be caused, though, by CO2 from human beings. It'll be caused by extraterrestrial events, which are beyond our control. And that's the real lesson of eschatology. If the world is going to come to an end tomorrow, did I do something good today? And that's good eschatology, and that's in the Quran as well as in the Bible, by the way. You know, if you knew the world was something like, if you know the world's going to end tomorrow, you should plant a tree today. I'm paraphrasing, but roughly speaking, that's a paraphrase from the Quran, which is eschatological, and it's good.
Yeah, the hadith actually says that, you know, if you have a sapling in your hand and you see Judgment Day coming, then plant the sapling, plant the seed. Now, there was a question on entropy, or the state of disorder and chaos, you know, and whether the Gaia theory can sort of neutralize such an event, which I would imagine would be sort of the beginning of the end of time, for instance. I mean, this is sort of related to your idea about eschatology, but this was the question asked by one of the audience members.
So whether it can neutralize more kind of eschatologies or mechanistic?
No, entropy, randomness, or this chaotic order in the Earth system.
Well, I think that the Gaia theory is important because it helps us to see that there is order in what we think is disorder. And that's the core of it. What we call chaos in nature is actually not chaos. Whereas over-controlled human systems are often the cause of disease and pathology. That's true of mental illness, it's true of physical illness, it's true of food systems. And to the extent that Gaian theory influences agriculture, influences medicine, I mean, the discovery in the last 20 years of the human microbiome and its significance for human health and immunity is Gaian, right? So for me, it is, although it's controversial, I still think that the Gaia theory is continuing to be productive in terms of new discoveries. And you know, we've discovered, for example, quite recently that people who eat a more varied diet, more fruit and vegetables, have a better mental state. And in the past, doctors thought, oh, that's just placebo. But now we actually know that what you ingest influences your mood. So you might be better off changing your diet than taking Prozac. But Prozac is the mechanistic solution. Changing your diet is the holistic, the Gaia solution. So I think Gaia will continue to have an influence, and I hope it grows as a way of thinking.
Okay, Sister Ines, can I invite you just one more time to
I didn't get properly the question.
Just very
if you could
quickly.
put it in like 3 or 4 words.
Yeah.
I didn't really get it. I'm sorry.
The second question. Because the earth, the Gaia, wants to grow, because it is alive. When something is alive, something wants to grow. And also, the second part is about development. Development tends to hinder the growth of the earth. So there are 2 interests. Humans want to develop, but the earth also wants to grow. So how to negotiate these 2 interests?
Right. I mean, there is this also sort of worldwide movement on degrowth, as you know, right? And the sort of anti-development kind of movement as well, saying that, you know, we can't be developing all the time, assuming that, you know, the living resources are all scarce and limited. So what's your
I think that all the predictions made by environmentalists about resources running out have not come true. The main reason energy is going up in the moment is because of control coming from the UN climate science approach. It's not because energy is running out. Of course, energy can never run out. Oil is the second most abundant liquid on the planet. Gas is one of the most abundant, natural gas is one of the most abundant gases in the crust of the earth. So resources are not running out. But if, as Sri Lanka did a couple of years ago, you close down all the artificial fertilizer factories and tell your farmers just to use a bit of seaweed, people are going to run out of food. You don't get from an industrial system to a Gaian system overnight. It has to be done through a transition and a process of education. And if you try to do it overnight in a revolutionary way, people are going to die. And it led to the overthrow of the government of Sri Lanka. But people were going hungry in Sri Lanka as a result of that extremely unwise intervention by the government. I would like all farmers to get artificial fertilizers, but not in such a way as to cause a global famine or a world food shortage. So there is not a world food shortage. There ought never to be a world food shortage. If you see a food shortage emerging in the world in the next few years, it will have been socially constructed by people who want you to believe that the end of the world is nigh. It will not be real. It'll be an artifact. And that is important to bear in mind. As a person of faith, I believe the world has more than enough for all of us. It's the wealthy, the globalists, the people who want to control everything, who are the ones who are depriving other people of what they need in their lives. There's a brilliant study by Amartya Sen of famines in India. And the history of famine in India is almost completely contiguous with the history of the British Empire. They were created by imperial power. They were an artifact of empire. They were not natural, evolved, ecological, or a result of Indian culture, but of impositions on Indian culture by outsiders who didn't understand it, just like the Bali irrigation project.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I'd like to invite everyone now to give a round of applause to Michael Northcott. All right, we have, first of all, can we have the three people who asked the questions to come forward, please? And I'd like to ask Mas Iqbal to give the copies of the book to them. Would you like? Yes. Yeah. Would you like to stand?
Sure.